The Late Show studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as Alan Ritchson settled into the guest chair across from Stephen Colbert. Fresh off his massive success with Reacher, Alan had agreed to what was supposed to be a straightforward promotional interview. The cameras rolled, the audience applauded, and everything seemed perfectly normal, at least on the surface. Stephen leaned back in his chair with that trademark smirk, shuffling through his note cards with an air of casual confidence that had served him well for years. But something felt different tonight, something that Alan picked up on immediately. The host's demeanor carried an edge, a subtle condescension that Alan had encountered before with other interviewers who seemed to think they were somehow above their guests. "So, Alan," Stephen began, his voice carrying that familiar late-night television cadence. "Reacher has been quite the success story. Tell me, how does it feel to play such a, shall we say, intellectually simple character?" The question landed with a thud, and Alan's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't the typical softball question most guests received. Alan maintained his composure, offering a diplomatic smile. "Well, Stephen, I think you might be misunderstanding the character. Jack Reacher is actually incredibly intelligent. He's a former military investigator with advanced degrees and exceptional analytical skills. The physicality is just one aspect of who he is." Stephen waved his hand dismissively, clearly not interested in Alan's thoughtful response. Right. But let's be honest here, it's mostly about the action scenes and the tough guy persona, isn't it? I mean, we're not exactly talking Shakespeare here." The studio audience remained politely quiet, but you could sense the tension building. "Actually," Alan replied, his voice remaining steady but with a hint of firmness creeping in, "the show deals with complex themes of justice, moral ambiguity, and the challenges veterans face when reintegrating into civilian life. There's quite a bit of depth there if you're willing to look for it." Stephen's smile became more forced, and he leaned forward slightly. "Come on, Alan. You don't have to sell me the highbrow angle. We all know what this really is. It's a show for people who want to see someone beat up bad guys without having to think too hard about it. Nothing wrong with that. Entertainment is entertainment." The dismissive tone was becoming impossible to ignore, and Alan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Here was an actor who had put tremendous thought and preparation into his role, who had worked closely with military consultants and veterans to bring authenticity to the character, being told by someone who had clearly never watched the show that his work was essentially mindless entertainment. "Stephen, I think you're doing a disservice to both the source material and the audience," Alan said, his voice still controlled but carrying more weight now. "Lee Child created a character with real depth, and our viewers are intelligent enough to appreciate the nuances we've tried to bring to the screen." Stephen chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nuances, right? Look, I get it. You have to defend your work, but between you and me, and everyone watching, we both know this isn't exactly prestige television. It's perfectly fine to admit you're in it for the paycheck and the fun of playing action hero." The condescension was now unmistakable, and Alan felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about defending his work anymore, this was about respect, something that seemed to be in short supply from the man sitting across from him. The audience was starting to sense the change in atmosphere, the polite chuckles becoming more scattered and uncertain. "You know what, Stephen?" Alan said, his voice dropping to a more serious register. "I came here tonight thinking we were going to have a genuine conversation about the craft of storytelling and the responsibility that comes with bringing beloved characters to life. Instead, it seems like you've already made up your mind about what you think my work is worth." Stephen's expression hardened slightly, realizing that his guest wasn't going to play along with the dismissive banter he had planned. "I'm just trying to keep things real here, Alan. No need to get defensive about it." "Defensive?" Alan repeated, his eyebrows raising. "I'm not being defensive, I'm being accurate. And frankly, I'm starting to wonder if you've actually watched the show you're so quick to dismiss, or if you're just working off assumptions and stereotypes." The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far removed from the typical late-night television banter. Stephen's smile was becoming more strained by the second, and his grip on his note cards was visibly tightening. "Of course I've seen the show," Stephen replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Look, we're getting a bit off track here. Let's talk about your background, your journey to this role." But Alan wasn't ready to let it go. "No, actually, let's stay on track. You made some pretty specific claims about the show and its audience, so I'm curious what episodes you watched that led you to those conclusions." The challenge was direct and impossible to ignore. Stephen's face flushed slightly as he realized he had been called out, and not in the playful way that usually happened during his interviews. This was a guest who wasn't going to be dismissed or talked down to, and it was becoming clear that the host had seriously underestimated the man sitting across from him. Stephen's discomfort was becoming more apparent by the second, as Alan waited patiently for an answer to his direct question. The host tried to deflect with a nervous laugh, but Alan's steady gaze made it clear he wasn't going to let this slide. "Well, you know, Alan, I don't keep a detailed log of every episode I watch," Stephen said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "But I think I have a pretty good sense of what the show is about." "A pretty good sense," Alan repeated slowly, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. "So you're comfortable making judgments about the intelligence of the writing and the audience based on a pretty good sense?" The tension in the studio was now palpable. Audience members were shifting in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing an entertaining verbal sparring match or something genuinely uncomfortable. Stephen's production team behind the cameras was exchanging worried glances, wondering if they should signal for a commercial break. "Look, Alan, I think you're taking this way too seriously," Stephen said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "This is supposed to be fun, light entertainment. We're not conducting a graduate seminar here." "And there it is," Alan said, his voice rising slightly. "You've just perfectly illustrated the problem. You think because this is entertainment television, there's no room for substance or serious discussion. You've decided that anything involving action or popular appeal must automatically be beneath intellectual consideration." Stephen's mask was slipping further now, his irritation becoming obvious. "I've been doing this show for years, Alan. I know how to have substantive conversations when the situation calls for it. But I also know my audience, and I know what works." "Your audience," Alan said, leaning forward in his chair. "You mean the same audience you just implied isn't smart enough to appreciate complexity in their entertainment? The same people you suggested just want to see someone beat up bad guys without thinking?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Stephen's face reddened further. He had been caught in his own contradictory statements, and worse, he had been caught by someone who clearly wasn't going to let him wiggle out of it with his usual charm and deflection tactics. "I never said my audience wasn't smart," Stephen protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You didn't have to say it directly," Alan replied. "But when you dismiss something as mindless entertainment and then say, 'You know what works for your audience,' the implication is pretty clear. You're talking down to everyone in this room." The audience was now completely silent, some nodding slightly at Alan's words, others looking uncomfortable at witnessing such a direct confrontation. Stephen's usual supporters in the crowd seemed uncertain about how to react, torn between loyalty to their host and recognition that the guest had made some valid points. "You know what, Alan?" Stephen said, his voice taking on a cold, professional tone. "I think maybe we should move on to a different topic. Let's talk about your other projects." "No," Alan said firmly, surprising everyone including Stephen. "I don't think we should move on. I think we should address what just happened here, because it's actually pretty important." Stephen's eyes flashed with anger. Years of being the one in control, the one asking the questions and steering the conversation, had not prepared him for a guest who refused to be managed or manipulated. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Alan said, his voice calm but unwavering. "We're sitting here in front of all these people, and on national television, and you just spent the last several minutes making assumptions about my work, my audience, and, frankly, about the intelligence of everyone watching. I think that deserves to be addressed." "This is my show," Stephen said, his voice rising slightly, the professional veneer finally cracking. "I ask the questions here." "And I'm your guest," Alan replied without missing a beat. "Which means I'm here voluntarily, sharing my time and my thoughts with you and your audience. That should come with a basic level of respect, don't you think?" The word respect seemed to hit Stephen like a physical blow. He had built his career on being the smartest person in the room, the one who could dissect politicians and celebrities with wit and insight. But here was someone calling him out not for his intelligence, but for his character, his basic decency. As a human being, "I've been nothing but respectful," Stephen said, but even he seemed to know how hollow the words sounded. "Have you?" Alan asked, his voice quiet but cutting. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you decided before I even walked out here what you thought of me and my work. You've been condescending, dismissive, and frankly pretty arrogant about it." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as Alan's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Stephen's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find a response that would salvage the situation, but the damage was already done. His mask had slipped too far, and everyone could see the person underneath, someone who had become so comfortable in his position of power that he had forgotten how to treat his guests with basic human dignity. "I think," Stephen said finally, his voice barely controlled, "that maybe you're not the right fit for this kind of interview format." The words were meant as a dismissal, a way to end the conversation on his terms, but Alan wasn't having it. "What kind of format is that, Stephen? The kind where you get to talk down to your guests and they're supposed to just smile and take it?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Stephen's face went through a series of expressions, from anger to embarrassment to something approaching panic. He had lost control of his own show, and worse, he was losing it in front of millions of viewers and a studio audience that was now clearly on the side of his guest. "You know what?" Stephen said, his voice shaking slightly with barely contained rage. "I don't have to sit here and be lectured by some actor who thinks playing a tough guy on TV makes him an expert on everything." The insult was delivered with venom, and the studio audience audibly gasped. Several people in the front rows shook their heads in disapproval, while others looked genuinely shocked at their host's behavior. This was not the Stephen Colbert they had come to see. This was someone else entirely. Someone petty and mean-spirited. Alan sat back in his chair, a look of sad understanding crossing his face. "There it is," he said quietly. "That's what this has been about all along, hasn't it? Some actor. That's how you see me. That's how you see anyone who doesn't fit into your narrow definition of what constitutes legitimate work or legitimate thought." "Don't psychoanalyze me," Stephen snapped, his professional composure completely abandoned now. "You come on my show, you play by my rules, and you show some respect for the process." "Respect," Alan repeated, standing up from his chair. "That's an interesting word coming from someone who spent the last 15 minutes showing nothing but disrespect to me, to my work, and to every person watching this who happens to enjoy the show I'm part of." The action of standing up sent a clear message throughout the studio. This wasn't just a heated discussion anymore. This was a guest preparing to leave, something that almost never happened in the world of late-night television. Stephen's production team was frantically signaling from behind the cameras, but the host seemed oblivious to everything except his own wounded pride. "Sit down," Stephen demanded, his voice rising to near-shouting level. "We're not done here." "Actually, we are," Alan said calmly, removing his wireless microphone and setting it down on the small table next to his chair. "I came here to have a conversation about my work and hopefully connect with your audience. Instead, I got insulted, dismissed, and talked down to by someone who apparently thinks being behind that desk gives him the right to treat people however he wants. The studio audience was now openly murmuring, some calling out support for Alan, while others seemed stunned by the unprecedented breakdown of the interview format. Stephen looked around the room as if seeing his audience for the first time, realizing that he had lost them completely. "You can't just walk out," Stephen said, desperation creeping into his voice. "This is live television." "Watch me," Alan replied, taking a step toward the edge of the stage. "I've got better things to do than sit here and be your punching bag for whatever issues you're dealing with tonight." "Security!" Stephen called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Don't let him leave the stage!" The call for security was the final straw for many in the audience, who began booing openly. The idea that a host would try to physically prevent a guest from leaving after treating them so poorly struck everyone as beyond the pale. Even Stephen seemed to realize immediately that he had gone too far, his face paling as he heard the reaction from his own audience. "No, wait," Stephen said quickly. "I didn't mean that. He paused, looking around the hostile room. "I just think we should try to end this professionally." Alan turned back to face him, his expression a mixture of disappointment and something approaching pity. "Professionally?" "Stephen, there was nothing professional about any of this. You ambushed me with loaded questions, dismissed my responses, insulted my work and intelligence, and then tried to have me physically restrained when I decided I'd had enough." The litany of Stephen's behavior, laid out so clearly and calmly, seemed to hit the host like a series of physical blows. He slumped back in his chair, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done, not just to his guest, but to his own reputation and show. Stephen started, then stopped, seeming to realize that anything he said at this point would only make things worse. "Yeah," Alan said, nodding slightly. "That's probably the smartest thing you've done all night. Just sit there and think about what just happened here, and maybe, if you're capable of it, learn something from it." With that, Alan walked off the stage to spontaneous applause from large sections of the studio audience. Stephen sat alone at his desk, staring out at a room full of people who had just watched him reveal himself to be everything wrong with celebrity culture and media arrogance. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of his humiliation, as he struggled to find words that might salvage the situation. "We'll be right back," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, but everyone knew there would be no coming back from what had just happened. The damage was done, the mask was off, and millions of viewers had just witnessed one of the most spectacular meltdowns in late-night television history. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Did Alan handle this the right way? Or should he have tried to work with Stephen despite the disrespect? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from Hollywood that you won't hear anywhere else.